Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the Climate Resilience, Eskom Tariff Fight and Eswatini Crisis episode of Ubuntunomics podcast. This week we'll be looking at Treasury mainstreaming climate change, Eskom taking NERSA to court over tariffs, the inaugural SA-Côte JCC, and China's donation to the DSD. And in the Africa regional update, we'll be looking at Total supporting resumption of government services in Cabo, Delgado, Eswatini protests and school closures, aerial attacks in Tigray, and the Central African Republic ceasefire. And before we get started, it's another plea to all our listeners on whatever platform you may be listening to. Please hit the subscribe button to keep up to date with all future updates from Ubuntunomics podcast. And if you're enjoying this episode, please hit us with a like and share amongst your friends and family. With me this week is Sbu Nyati from Eskom Assets. Hello Sbu, how are you doing this week?
No, can't complain, Sia. I'm well, thanks, man. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Just all hot, and I'm joining you from Zambia still, and I'm out in Teshi today. But it's quite hot out here. Nonetheless, it's been quite a good and productive trip. With us this week also is Zama Matungandaba from M&M Legal. Hello Zama, how are you doing this week?
Hey there, Sia. I'm doing well. How you doing? How you doing, Spoo? Great to be back this week.
Yeah, well, thank you, Zama.
Thanks for joining us, Zama, and we've missed you as always. Without further ado, let's get started with the SA update this week. And our first story in the SA update this week is Treasury mainstreams climate change reporting. National Treasury has published a framework for prioritizing climate change in addition to return on investment in financial institutions' lending and investment decisions. The framework is aimed at ensuring that all financial institutions embed and improve their capability for identifying, managing, and disclosing environmental and social risks in their portfolios. Government hopes that it will encourage a transition to a lower carbon, greener, and climate resilient economy by strengthening the regulatory framework applicable to banking, retirement funds, insurance, asset management, and capital markets. Climate change planning is being incorporated in the budget process, fiscal risk monitoring, and tracking of climate-related expenditure by National Treasury. Zama, you had a few questions regarding this story.
Yes, Sia, I was just trying to understand the rationale a little bit more. So I wanted to find out, is this from the perspective of financial institutions investing in greener companies, or is it something else?
This piece of legislation and focus of Treasury is more applicable to financial institutions as highlighted, and the idea is that they will then cascade this responsibility, firstly by making it a requirement for financial institutions, who will then obviously cascade that requirement onto their clients on whom they lend or invest in order to ensure that there is regular reporting, but also management of these risks associated with climate change in the investment and lending decisions of financial institutions. Sbu, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I would say this is long overdue. They've been talking about this for a long time, since COP17, that's a decade ago. And then there was all that hype about SDGs, and there was more lip service because they were talking about economic inclusion and all of that. But we should give some credit, for starters, to National Treasury for finally doing something tangible about climate change and the environment. We should at the same time not miss what it is that got them to act. What it is the ESG investment analytics Those are ratings or scores which have become a prerequisite in order to access, to assess the impact of investments by institutional lenders. National Treasury was jolted into action this time around because sovereign ratings agencies now have these ratings which provide insight into the credit relevance and of environmental and social and governance factors. I mean, these credit ratings agencies now use ESG relevance scores to communicate the effect of these factors on both tax-supported and revenue-supported issuer ratings. So now environmental factors have gained more relevance and importance since 2019. It was May 2019. And you'll remember that even this year, we've had earthquakes, we've had fires, we've had floods, and all of these things. So now they are recording by things like biodiversity and natural resource management and natural disasters and everything to do with climate change. You might remember that we covered a number of stories about biodiversity on the continent in the recent past. And all these now have a direct impact, a direct bearing, an economic bearing on how countries will be able to access funding from capital markets. So the Treasury, National Treasury, was acted upon because you'll remember that in South Africa we rely too much on sovereign ratings agencies to rate us so that we can go out and borrow from the global capital markets.
Sure. Look, I definitely agree with you, and without sounding like much of a climate change denialist, which I'm not, I don't think that this is necessarily about climate change per se, and I agree with you. It's actually more about access to capital markets, which themselves are changing. And I think it for me points to a need for a broader change and a relook at economics generally. I think what we currently take as the priority and the focus of economics being the profit motive and efficiency of markets has not served us. And in fact, what we need to incorporate more significantly is the sustainability and an understanding of the complete impact and risks associated with the way in which firms and the way in which we ostensibly distribute and use the resources at bay. I think it's not enough that economics just looks at resources such as human capital or money without looking at the way in which we use and utilize natural resources and the environment, which I think is one of our most important resources. So I think that's the one point for me, that this is not necessarily about climate change. And this is also my biggest gripe about this whole green revolution, in that it doesn't actually have a concerted effort on minimizing human behavior such as excessive consumption, the degradation of environments associated with production, etc. It's actually just trying to reduce greenhouse gases. And you see this in the way in which firms have jumped onto the bandwagon of the end of the internal combustion engine, for example, by pushing towards electronic vehicles, etc., which in and of themselves do reduce a great contribution in terms of greenhouse gases, but actually have got secondary impacts in terms of the environment with the kind of resources that we're going to be looking at. Obviously, there's going to be a greater demand for electricity, and by and large, the most sustainable or stable way of generating electricity currently is through fossil fuels, coal being one of these. On that note, that takes us to the next story in the SA update. Eskom takes NERSA to court over tariffs. Eskom has initiated proceedings in the High Court to review the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, NERSA's decision taken on the 30th of September 2021 to reject Eskom's fifth multi-year price determination MYPD5 revenue application. Eskom hopes that the court will set aside the NERSA decision, order NERSA to consider the MYPD5 revenue application, and set timelines for this process. NERSA recently endorsed a pricing methodology review to ensure sustainable electricity prices and consequently rejected Eskom's MYPD5 revenue application. The new methodology is aimed at enabling transformation of the South African electricity industry, resolving energy security concerns and rising electricity prices, and encourage independent electricity generation. Eskom has argued that its application was made in accordance with the existing methodology, which is valid until replaced by a new methodology. But NERSA maintains that the methodology is expired and is not in public interest. Zama, you had a few points to make regarding the efficiency of Eskom as well as the need to contain the rising electricity prices.
100%. Sia, look, electricity prices in South Africa are definitely a cause for concern. I know many communities where people are complaining about, electricity usage, particularly when we came, from the winter months, the colder months where we see usage increasing. And this highlights that, outside of Eskom itself, the electricity market simply needs to be more competitive. We need more independent power producers, and it goes without saying. So, I was wondering what NERSA's main reasons were for rejecting the MYPD5. I mean, upon reading, I note that they are saying that Eskom should come with this new methodology, and Eskom saying, but you guys have not applied this new methodology, so how it is not in existence, so how can we actually give you pricing that is in accordance with this new methodology? So Eskom is actually asking for NERSA to approve at least 1 year of its application, because they made a price application for the next sort of 3 to 4 years. So they're asking for just 1 year of approval, and NERSA is saying, no, go back and just, do something new. So I'm just thinking, what do you know about this, and what do you think about this? Because I'm thinking, is this not just going to delay everything, particularly from the side of NERSA? Is this not just delay tactics? I mean, I understand that we need to improve our pricing methodologies. However, there's no new methodology. So who do you think is sort of in the wrong in this instance?
Look, I do think that I agree with you partially, in that I agree we do need to improve the efficiency of Eskom, particularly given its importance in the economy, but also some of the losses that are attributed to the utility. And I think this is also what's at the core of the contention, is that what is really the cost of delivering electricity from Eskom, and what portion of this is sort of necessary and unavoidable costs, and what portion of this is due to inefficiencies associated with how Eskom manages its operations. And this is where I think there's also some politicking involved, in that what we were promised with Eskom, particularly given the last major bailout that they received, was that there was going to be an unbundling of the electricity generation versus the distribution network, etc. And we haven't really seen this. And what we've seen is some dividends in terms of the improved management of Eskom and how they've been able to service some of the debt. But this is largely on the back of rising or escalating electricity tariffs. And the problem with that is the rising cost of energy, which is passed on to consumers and producers, is actually a constraint and a major bottleneck in the economy and our economic recovery, both from the pandemic, but even, from our economic woes which predate the pandemic. And so this is partially why NERSA has found itself at a difficult place of not willing to accept this new tariff application on the back of some of the structural changes that Eskom has promised and have not been implemented, And I guess also the issue of the methodology being expired, which I think is really something that NERSA is really hiding behind, or sort of a scapegoat, when in actual fact we do need to speak about the efficiencies or inefficiencies at Eskom. Where I slightly disagree, though, is on the need for independent power producers, and I think we need to understand that utility monopolies, particularly for electricity and certain other utilities, exist for a reason, mainly because they come with efficiencies of scale that cannot be achieved by independent power producers that either break or segment the market into smaller chunks. And so, yes, we do need to improve the efficiency of Eskom, but competition from IPPs is not necessarily the best way to go about this. What we need to do is clean up house in Eskom and make sure that it operates like a business and operates at the highest level of efficiency. Sbu, you had a point also to make around this scapegoat of an expired methodology.
NERSA could be said to be a bit naughty on this one, and may end up. They may end up losing the court case. NERSA says the existing methodology has expired, yet in the same breath, their new. The new methodology has not been finalized as yet. And so they say to Eskom, apply based on this new methodology, whereas there's no new methodology. How then must Eskom comply with something that does not exist, something that's not there? So wouldn't there a sensible thing be to first complete the process of developing this new methodology? After that is completed, then compel Eskom to submit their MPD5 revenue application based on the new methodology. So pressure has been mounting also for some years for NERSA to act more like a regulator, not simply endorse every price hike that Eskom asks for. The pricing methodology should have long been scrapped because it is retrospective in nature. It leads to manipulation by the same Eskom, who gets away with passing on to the consumer their inefficiencies and costs resulting from mismanagement. There's also the part about politics coming into it. The new finance minister has categorically said that we need an efficient Eskom in order to kickstart the economy after the COVID-19 pandemic. That's right. He's right. He's right by saying that because energy costs are critical for reigniting our manufacturing, our industrialization. We need to create jobs, and manufacturing and our industrial capacity are the only avenues that will open that path. So NERSA should act tough with Eskom, but they should also play by the rules. A regulator must also not be seen to be a bully. So I think NERSA is going to lose, and
I definitely agree with you. I think the shaky grounds which they've rejected the application on is poor decision making on the part of NERSA, but definitely they do need to balance the public interest with the needs of Eskom in terms of this escalation. On that note, it brings us to the next story in the SA update, the inaugural SA-Côte d'Ivoire JCC. The South African delegation participated in an inaugural session of the Joint Commission for Cooperation, JCC, with the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire in Abidjan from 19th until the 21st of October. The JCC, which was established in 2015, will provide an opportunity for the two countries to review the status of bilateral relations and exchange views about continental and global issues of mutual concern. The countries formally established diplomatic relations on 21 May 1992. Zama, what are your thoughts on this one?
I think it's really, really exciting. I love any sort of, joint collaboration efforts between African countries. But I just had a question around what opportunities do you see arising, Sia, or rather, which areas of common concern would you maybe note between Cote d'Ivoire and South Africa?
I think generally it is these two agendas. I think firstly the issues of security in the Sahel and West African region, which unless we deal with the problem of security cannot help accumulate the global or the continental trade agenda. And then secondly is promotion of the intra-Africa trade agenda, which I think is where the two countries align. Smoo, you had a comment to make about the slow pace of diplomatic relations and diplomacy in general.
I mean, diplomatic relations started way back in May 1992. It has taken them almost 3 decades to seriously move towards official trade agreements. My view is that diplomatic relations by themselves are not adequate. What cements diplomatic relations is signed trade deals, wherein both countries have their interests protected and advanced by a set of clearly defined, mutually beneficial rules. Then again, one has to take into consideration the period of insecurity, and it almost erupted into a civil war at some stage. Again, we have to also consider that there is this Anglo-Franco divide that has both cultural and business ramifications. And maybe I should be asking you the question, what is your view on this? Because you've recently been to the country, and I know that you've even taken the trouble to learn French, which is not a common thing in South Africa. So yeah. Wow, what are your insights?
Oui. I think, look, firstly, I must commend the two countries for bridging the sort of Anglo-Francophone divide, which is a fictitious divide, and Cote d'Ivoire can gain a lot in terms of regional trade. And given that South Africa is charting the way with its common monetary area between South Africa, Lesotho, Eswatini, and Namibia, the Francophone countries, particularly in West Africa, can learn a lot from South Africa in terms of regional economic governance in their transition from the CFA Franc zone and amalgamating themselves with the West African Anglophone countries into the creation of the ECO. So, I mean, it sounds all high level, but the point is there are really major significant governance dividends that can accrue for both countries and diplomatic dividends, but also unifying the continent above and beyond the sort of Anglo-Francophone divide which exists, that is also a major cultural obstacle towards the unification of Africa and the regional and Africa continental trade agenda that both our country as well as the West African region are definitely pushing and have a mutual interest in ensuring. On that note, that brings us to the last story in the SA update. China Embassy supports DSD. The Department of Social Development, DSD, has received donations of food vouchers valued at 500,000 Rand and face masks worth 50,000 Rand from the Embassy of the People's Republic of China. The DSD has welcomed the donations, which are expected to contribute towards assisting Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal communities that were affected by the recent unrest and looting. Smoo, what are your thoughts on this one?
Every donation is welcome. That's my first comment, no matter how small it is. Yeah, I add that last part.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I have to add that last part because this donation is tiny for a superpower. I mean, China is projected to surpass the US GDP in less than 2 decades. When you're that big, soft power is very important. It's a tool that comes in handy when it comes to things like trade and investment. We shall remember how difficult it was it has been for China to get their vaccines approved in South Africa. I mean, in South Africa, if truth be told, there's a lot of China
Xenophobia.
rejection of China. Yes, xenophobia.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the word. Yeah, because I mean, China is said to be the next another imperialist power. I mean, on the other hand, you have the US or Western countries. They've easily we've accepted their vaccines. Even some of them were approved even before rigorous testing was done. And then the partnerships with their companies. I mean, we have BioVac and Aspen, who are in partnership with Pfizer and J&J, and we've got the car industry, where we assemble all of these European and American cars. So these matters speak volumes. I mean, there's small gestures like donations and all of that, because I should mention at this point that the US supports the world's biggest HIV and AIDS program in the world. Here in South Africa, they give us billions. And so when we talk trade, when we talk investments, I mean, it's not that one is leaning towards the West, but it's what we have to gain from the West as well. I mean, China, in this instance, I think they're punching way below their weight, whether they consider themselves a developing economy or they are not, but they just have to step up to the plate, I think.
Yep, definitely. That's precisely my sentiment. Zama, you raised a few critical questions and a point about how China is sort of flexing its muscle in this one, and whether or not China should consider having placed its donations in a different sector, such as education, where much more support is actually needed.
100%, yeah. So I was thinking to myself, what will donations of perishable items such as masks, which we often are supposed to change after literally one wear, and food, which gets eaten, help with anything? To me, honestly, it sounds like China trying to flex some sort of political muscle for its benefit. And South Africa is simply agreeing. I mean, going back to Spoo's point, the donation is measly. And really, knowing China as a superpower, I understand we're all part of BRICS, we have similar economies, but our economies are far from similar. China is on its way to imperialism, China, and they really do have a lot more capabilities. So for me, I was like, this sounds like some sort of political muscle. And I think that also the money was misplaced. I think they could have done something else with the money, send kids to school, buy books, buy pads, build classrooms. I mean, we already have a social grant system in place here in South Africa. So I'm not really sure, there has to be something deeper.
Yeah, look, I definitely agree with both your sentiments. It almost seems as though it was a board mission in Pretoria looking for a PR episode. And I think they could have had, much more impact in other areas, remote learning, telecoms, etc. But in any case, as Spoo said, all and any donations are welcome, no matter how small. On that note, that brings an end to the SA update this week. And I want to again reiterate to our listeners on whatever platform you're listening on, please hit the subscribe button. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit the like button and share the episode with your family and friends. And that brings us to the Africa Regional Update this week. And the first story in the Africa Regional Update is Total supports government services in Cabo Delgado. Total Energies is supporting the return of government services to conflict-affected parts of Cabo Delgado through sponsoring of 16 flat packs to the provincial government. The flat packs will be used to temporarily house nurses, teachers, police, and other government officials returning to the districts of Makomia and Kisanga. The return of government services is an essential part to bringing back stability and confidence to the affected communities, and this follows on the 26th of April the Total decision to declare a force majeure on the Mozambique LNG project and withdraw all its personnel in Afungi province due to the violence in Cabo Delgado. Zama, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I welcome this. I think these are the kinds of public-private partnerships which would do very well to aid with the development of the African continent. So I do welcome this. However, I would just warn to say that governments should accept that while public-private partnerships are all good and well, they should not find themselves in a situation where they are essentially captured, inverted commas, because usually these companies would never do, any of these activities from the goodness of their hearts.
Sbu, you seem to echo similar sentiments.
Yeah, I do. I mean, this is what we've been talking about all along. I mean, episode after episode, we've been talking about the social responsibility by investors. But in all honesty, this work should have been done by the Mozambican government. Social amenities and social services are the government's responsibility. That said, though, this assistance should be by default. There should be the default position. It should be expected to be part of the initial investment talks. I mean, from pre-planning. I mean, what we find in most cases is that investors end up building infrastructure that is for their own use, and they would then parade it as though it is some social investment, sort of like they'll build a road that leads directly to their plant, and then they'll say, we built you a road, whereas they'll be using that road or a railway line.
On that note, that brings us to the next story in the Africa Regional Update: Eswatini protests and school closures. The government of Eswatini has decided to close schools indefinitely following a spate of riots, public violence, school boycotts in Ceasefire region. However, ongoing international examinations will proceed as planned, and the government is committed to provide security for students wishing to sit for exams. The government has deployed armed security forces at various schools, and there have been reports of excessive use of force in response to student protests led by the Swaziland National Union of Students, SNUS, demanding scholarships and jobs for all. On the 20th of October, the Public Sector Association of Swaziland, a coalition of trade unions comprised of NEPSAU, SNAT, and SNA, led public protests in Manzini demanding a public sector wage review, ending casualization and privatization of public service. These protests are a continuation of the demonstrations that started in May, when students demanded accountability for the death of a 25-year-old law student allegedly at the hands of police. Eswatini has faced rising socioeconomic challenges due to the economic downturn that has been worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic, with unemployment rising from 23% in 2016 to 33% in 2021. Zama, you had a question about some of the demands that were being made.
Yes. I mean, the Swaziland National Union of Students demanding scholarships and jobs for all. I think these demands sound quite extreme. For me, it actually is quite reminiscent of the fees must fall era. But I mean, I don't think it was scholarships and jobs for all. So I just think it sounds quite extreme. And then another thing that worried me was that the protests are actually a continuation of demonstrations that started in May already. And, this was all around the death of a 25-year-old law student, allegedly at the hands of the police. So this is quite worrying for me. And I noticed another story whereby in South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa has sent our old minister, Mr. Delgado, and others to Eswatini as well to go visit the king there. So I'm just wondering when their next democratic election is, because with all this that I'm noticing, rise of social economic challenges, unemployment levels, it's clear that we should simply vote their ruling party out, that they should do that. So those are my thoughts around these. What do you think?
Sure. Look, I do think that some of the demands may seem a bit quite drastic or dramatic, but obviously this is also in the context of quite a lavish lifestyle that the government and the economy supports for the monarch in Eswatini, which a lot of the public protests have also centered around, given the unfair, monopoly over power and political power that the monarch still has. Eswatini obviously being one of the last remaining absolute monarchs in the world, is actually more than just about government services or demands on government at this point. And I do believe that you're right in saying that this is actually quite an interesting parallel to the period of fees must fall protests which took place in South Africa a couple of years back. Smoo, what are your thoughts on this one?
South Africa is once again loath to take the necessary initiative. South Africa is a big power in SADC. South Africa, we have a responsibility, and we choose to go the what did Thabo Mbeki call it? The
silent diplomacy route.
Silent diplomacy route. Yeah, man. I mean, this crisis is brewing along our borders, and it will eventually spill over into South Africa's territory, as is always the case with all of these countries, even with Lesotho and Zimbabwe. What I also find very revealing and interesting is that these uprisings are directly linked to the economic downturn and unemployment figures. If you have a look at those figures, 23% in around 2016, and now 33% in 2021, they mimic South Africa's figures. We were at around about 25% in 2016, and our unemployment rate is now 34%, and theirs is 33%. I mean, even these demands by these by the scholars and the nurses and what have you, they are exactly what pertains here in South Africa. Another factor that we should not miss is the role of the EFF in Swaziland. I mean, Swaziland basically is like I call it a colony, a South African colony. Whatever you find here, you also find there. Their king, Mswati, is exactly the same as the previous king of the Zulu nation. They also have a similar Ngonyama Trust thing going there, where all of these tribal leaders support the king.
Definitely agree with you on that one, Spoon, in terms of the parallels. And it takes me back to some commentary I made on particularly the eve of the July public protests and looting in South Africa, that, this obviously gives an example, or at least portrayal, for how the political struggles can take place in some of the neighboring countries. And lo and behold, what we're seeing in Eswatini today. And soon thereafter, we also saw some protests in Lesotho around the same kind of economic challenges and socioeconomic issues that are reflected in these economies, which mirror the reality in South Africa. But I must say that we've moved on quite dramatically from the period of silent diplomacy under former President Thabo Mbeki. I think South Africa is actually picking and choosing its battles based on its own self-interest. Yes, we do have an interest in ensuring regional security, and so that the violence or some of the security issues in our neighboring countries don't spill over into South Africa. But we only seem to intervene if there's something in it for us. We didn't intervene in Zimbabwe, I think mainly due to political dividends between the two countries, but also we don't see anything to gain in Zimbabwe. We intervened quite quickly in the case of Lesotho when there were these high-level assassinations involved, and I think that's largely due to the dependence on the Lesotho Highlands Water Project for most of Gauteng's water demand. We intervened quite quickly in the case of Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. Yes, we were hiding behind the guise of a security concern, but actually what we were more interested in is the natural gas and its impact on the region. And so we seem to be self-interestedly intervening in the neighboring countries' concerns and leaving those where we have nothing to gain to fester and worsen under this agenda of silent diplomacy. On that note, that brings us to the next story in the Africa Regional Update: more aerial attacks in Tigray. There were reports of aerial attacks in the residential areas of Tigray's capital Mekele on 18 October. Fighting erupted since November 2020 in Tigray between the Ethiopian military and forces of the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, the TPLF. The fighting has left thousands killed amidst allegations of widespread human rights abuses and more than 2 million forced to flee their homes. In August 2021, the Ethiopian government agreed to a humanitarian ceasefire and allowed aid operations in Tigray. However, a lack of essential supplies, essentially cash and fuel, have severely disrupted humanitarian aid operations in Tigray, where at least 400,000 people are now facing famine-like conditions. Zama, you had a few comments about this one regarding the government claims as well as the ongoing conflict.
Yes, Sia. I just thought to myself, when I look at the story more deeply, I realized that the government is actually really letting the Ethiopian people down. Because I'm thinking to myself, why is violence still being perpetuated? Surely there has to be a way that the conflict can be resolved. What I'm beginning to see is a power dynamic between, the government and the TPLF, which leaves ordinary civilians in the center of the war. And I think they've just simply decided to view the ordinary civilians as collateral damage. I don't know what your views are on this.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a bit concerning. I mean, I understand obviously the skirmish between the federal government and the TPLF. However, the perpetration of attacks in public areas, particularly in the capital, is definitely seeing civilians as collateral damage. Smoo, you had a point also about this issue of civilians' involvement and the direction in which this conflict is going in terms of the likelihood of it blowing up as a fully blown civil war.
Yeah, I mean, the Ethiopian government claims that they were targeting an ammunition depot in the city. And the TPLF say the Ethiopian government is now targeting civilian areas because they are being repelled from all fronts. You will remember that the Ethiopian government has been they unleashed their military on Tigray from different fronts, from the Amhara region, from the Afar region, and directly at the capital. So claims have been that they have been losing on all of those fronts. So now they are targeting civilian areas. Now, an all-out military onslaught using conventional weapons is not advisable because it will lead to more widespread condemnation from from foreigners from countries like the US. I mean, you'll remember that a week ago, the US had the Kenyan president, Mr. Kenyatta, over, and they were discussing the matter about the issue of Ethiopia and the civil war, and the US is not on the side of the Ethiopian government. So there might be foreign assistance. I mean, if you unleash war on civilians, then foreign assistance gets legitimized, and the civil war could end up being a conventional war with foreign forces coming in. I mean, we already had Eritrea in Tigray. So civil wars are tricky and should be handled with utmost care, I think.
On that note, that brings us to the last story in the Africa Regional Update, the CAR ceasefire as a positive change. The Central African Republic CAR President Faustin Archange Touadéra announced a unilateral ceasefire. The truce is in line with a joint roadmap for peace adopted a month earlier by the countries that comprise the International Conference of the Great Lakes Region, the ICGLR. This is in turn has helped in reinvigoration of a February 2019 peace deal signed by the government and 14 armed groups in the country. Zama, you had a very simple yet poignant question around this story.
Why can't other war-stricken countries follow suit? Just taking it back to the story that we just covered now in Ethiopia. Why can't other war-stricken countries follow suit? If we do not strive for peace across the entire continent, we will never develop to our true potential as Africans.
On that note, that brings an end to the Africa Regional Update this week. And that brings us to the numbers game.
Okay.
So the number for this week is 5%. I'll give you guys one try. Zama, do you want to go first?
5%. It has to be the number which data prices have increased by in South Africa.
Okay. Nope. But almost close, but no cigar.
5%. 5% is the consumer price.
2 weeks in a row, Smooth. 2 weeks in a row. Okay, I'm gonna have to be more creative with these numbers. No, you're spot on, Smooth.
I felt it.
And last week he was spot on as well. So very impressed, very impressed.
I felt it. Nice one.
Nice one, Smooth. So CPI rose to 5% in September 2021. In September 2021, consumer price inflation CPI rose to 5% year on year, and CPI increased by 0.2% month on month. In August, it was 4.9% and had increased by 0.4% month to month. The largest positive contributors were food and beverages, which increased by 6.6%, contributing 1.1 percentage points. Housing and utilities increasing by 4% and contributing 1 percentage point. And transport, which increased by 10.1%, contributing 1.4 percentage points to CPI. On that note, that brings an end to our episode this week.